We're going to cover a little ground this morning, and you may want to put your seatbelts on. We'll be traveling in time as well as space. Now, I'm probably overselling it. We're going to start with a confession. The first time I remember feeling the effects of alcohol, I was walking home from my friend Joel Kaplan's bar mitzvah. I was the same age as Joel, 13, and had traded my cheesecake dessert for another glass of champagne. I didn't notice feeling anything different during the dinner, but I did on the way home. Through the years, I have come to enjoy a good cheesecake more than champagne, actually, but that was the deal I made then, and to be honest, I've never regretted it. Thankfully, the walk home was long enough that most of the effects had worn off by the time I got home. It feels odd and perhaps just a little bit shameful to state that my affinity, and affinity is not the right word, my deep love and appreciation for Judaism may stem from such a moment, but there it is. When I was beginning my ministerial career down the road in Livermore, the local synagogue congregation Beth Emek was still meeting in a refurbished World War II Quonset hut just a few blocks from the house I rented. So every now and then I'd walk to shul on a Friday night to worship. Now I've never learned Hebrew, and it took me a while to get the tunes down, but I have to admit there's something liberating in singing along to the best of one's ability, not knowing any of the words. They can mean anything you need them to mean. And yet I doubt much of Judaism would have resonated as long and as deeply as it had for me if it hadn't been for the depth of their traditions and practices. Today, we're in the midst of the Jewish High Holy Days, or as they are also called, the Days of Awe. To begin every new year with the restoration of right relationship. I'm humbled by it, challenged by it. And when I make those efforts every year, this time of year, it helps me become the person I most long to be. We lit our chalice this morning to words from a Reconstructionist synagogue in the city. We'll close our time of worship today with a spoken and sung meditation inspired by Yom Kippur. And during my time with you now this morning, I want to share some of what I've experienced and learned to some extent about reconciliation during my 4 years in, as Canadians often refer to their country, the Great White North. And to celebrate that I'm in California now, my desktop picture on my computer is of Anne walking our dog a couple Januaries ago with huge piles of snow in the foreground. From Wikipedia, in 2021, Sarah Bolio, an anthropologist at the University of the Fraser Valley in British Columbia, surveyed the apple orchard on the grounds of the Kamloops, British Columbia Residential School with ground-penetrating radar and concluded under the apple trees were probably some 200 unmarked graves. Since then, other surveys have identified upwards of 4,000 unmarked graves near former residential schools across Canada. And I need to add at this point a bit of a caveat. That number is unverified, and there's some controversy whether such graves actually exist or not. For my sake, I'm inclined to believe that many young children were buried on the grounds of those schools. It answers why so many families never saw their young ones again. Still, We can't be sure. I want to be careful and honest. In any case, when Ann and I headed up to Ottawa in July of 2021, I hadn't heard of those unmarked graves. What I knew was that Canada had begun a truth and reconciliation process in 2008 to document the extent and effects of the country's residential school system. The commission completed its work in 2015, concluding that the school system there amounted to cultural genocide. The findings in Kamloops and elsewhere across Canada triggered the consciousness of the country. Inspired by Phyllis's story, orange t-shirts started showing up all over the place, especially at this time of year. The first Orange Shirt Day took place on September 30th, 2013, and as I mentioned before, 10 years later, Canada named it a statutory holiday. If you were in certain provinces and working with certain employers, you got the day off from work. Both the Conservative Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau have formally apologized for the residential school system. When was the last time you heard two politically opposed U.S. presidents apologizing for the same thing? Or apologizing for anything, for that matter? Biden did for the U.S. residential schools. Cultural genocide. Powerful words, but even words like that can mask what was experienced. Families torn apart, children intentionally taught to disrespect their parents and their culture, all intentionally. As one Algonquin elder not so long ago said, "There's not enough whiskey in the world to cut through that pain." My interest in public reconciliation goes back a couple decades now. I think it started with an offhand conversation I had with a priest from Central America when I was in seminary. He came to the States to talk about liberation theology, and his perspective was that the promise of liberation theology fell short because before we did that, we needed a theology of tears. We needed a time to grieve, and then we could put things in more intellectual perspective. And then I had a month-long visit to South Africa during my first ministerial sabbatical in 2003. I had planned to go elsewhere and do something else, but as the sabbatical neared, going to Wales, where a friend of a friend had a cabin, and catching up on my reading just didn't sound interesting enough. And I came across a quote from Desmond Tutu, and I thought, oh, if I'm going anywhere, I could go to South Africa. No one in my family's been to the African continent. I'd be able to plant a flag. I had met U.S. volunteer poll monitors there when Nelson Mandela was elected president. And I wanted to see what the effects looked like on the street and in the day-to-day lives of South Africans 9 years later. Let me tell you one little excerpt from that time, that month. My takeaway was I had never seen so much razor wire in my life. If you go to where even middle-class whites live, there is razor wire everywhere on top of fences around their homes. And the only time I felt afraid was one night I was coming back, not late evening, mid-evening, 7 o'clock maybe, from the grocery store, and had a couple little bags of groceries that'll get me through the next couple of days, when I noticed I could hear footsteps behind me. There was a black man behind me, and he was getting a little closer. And I said, "Oh, this isn't good." And so I put down my sacks, and I said, "Take them, they're yours. I don't have anything else." And he replied, "I don't want that." Now, if you've ever traveled outside the country, you know that we Americans have a tell, to use the poker word. I don't play poker. Everyone can tell we're from the States. It's just, there's something about us. Maybe our arrogance, I have no idea. We stand out. And he said, "You're American. I don't want your bags. I want you to take me back home with you." Wow. We have power, you and I, that we aren't aware of most of the time. So, back to Canada. Their truth and reconciliation process. On September 30th and 21, maybe 22, because 21 doesn't sound right, but when they found out 4,000 graves, the National Cemetery, Beechwood Cemetery in Ottawa, gave over. It was actually a little larger than this, and I almost put a slide up. They had little tiles, each painted by an Indigenous children, and they organized them, a tile for each unmarked grave, and they marked them by residential school and by province. And we walked around the circle in silence. Folks in Canada, Indigenous folks primarily, are saying, "All right, reconciliation. What do you mean by that?" And of course, there's really no clear answer. And in the space taken up by an insufficient answer, another question rises. Why reconcile to something that was never good in the first place? I think they have a point, my friends. I think they have a point. And so I hold reconciliation on one hand, and I hold the notion of atonement, being at one, restoring right relationship in the other. And I'm beginning to think that atonement is much deeper than reconciliation. And when I think about all this with South Africa and my history as well, I can't but help but think back to the story, and this is where it gets a little wild, get your seatbelts on, of Mahatma Gandhi, of how he was politicized during his 21 years as a lawyer in South Africa, and how he began his nonviolent disobedience there. We may remember that he was thrown off a train in Pietermaritzburg after refusing to leave the first-class section where he had bought a reserved seat. But as a colored man, he was not able to sit there, thank you very much. Now, I don't normally think of Gandhi's work beginning in South Africa. You may be in the same boat. And I think that's because, simply put, he didn't have any impact there. He started his nonviolent protest there, but it didn't take root. And it didn't take root, in my opinion, because he wasn't able to trigger the conscience of the white South Africans, which, if you know me, is about as judgmental thing as I will ever say about anyone. It seems too harsh, too judgmental, and so I never publicly said that. But then I asked a former Roman Catholic priest from Durban, the same city where Gandhi had lived and worked, what he thought. And he replied, it saddens me to say it, but I think you're exactly right. That in India, with the British, Gandhi was able to trigger their conscience in a way he hadn't been able to do in Durban. Now, near the end of my time in South Africa, it was late June 2003, then President Bush, the younger, made a tour through Africa. You may remember hearing something in the news that at one outdoor speech, he looked cool. He was talking to everyone out. Air conditioning under the stage blew cool air at him. But he wasn't the only speaker. There were speakers before him and speakers for after him. Only he got the air conditioning. Another small yet pointed example that the U.S. is often not interested in a level playing field. We seem to like our exceptionalism very much, thank you. And this was decades before our current administration. Especially when Bush was there, one person, noticing that I was a Yank, actually spit on the ground in front of me as I walked down the street in Cape Town. Others, several, would pull me aside and say, when are you going to have your own truth and reconciliation process in the States? We had begun a war at that time on extremely flimsy, fabricated evidence. And so while even then, having a truth and reconciliation process here seemed lifetimes distant, completely unrealistic, that notion has stuck in my head. My Lord, we need one. And I also want to say one little thing about why the orange shirts are even perhaps more meaningful to me. My family has a couple of little things that we kept secret. Not exactly secret. My mother's maiden name, you know, the thing you answer on security tests for all your online stuff. My mother's maiden name is Custer. And when my Aunt Jean married into the family, she did a little genealogical work, and she found that General George Armstrong Custer never had any children with his white wife. So, whew, we're saved. Kinda. But the catch is still there. How might we atone for whatever we need to atone for? We realize that. We give space for it. We give space for perhaps not knowing all the answers. We listen to voices we don't normally hear from. We give them space. We choose to believe them, even when 100% of the evidence may not be in for us. We start small. Atonement can feel like a big stretch. It's wider and deeper in scope. The wider and the deeper the scope, the more practice it's going to take. I'll close now with these words from an Indigenous woman who is, or was, the executive vice president of the Seattle Indian Health Board and the director of the Urban Indian Health Institute. Her name is Abigail Echo Hawk, and she writes about the unmarked graves in residential schools across this continent. When they buried the children, what they didn't know was that they were lovingly embraced by the land, held and cradled in a mother's heart The trees wept for them. With the wind they sang morning songs their mothers did not know to sing. Bending branches to touch the earth around them, the Creator cried for them, the tears falling like rain. Mother Earth held them until they could be found. New voices sing the morning songs with the trees, the wind, light sacred fire. Ensure they are never forgotten as we sing one word, one song, justice. So may it be. Amen.